Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Leon Hartwell. Welcome to our 23rd LSE IDEAS Russia-Ukraine Dialogue. We are part funded by Pifer, an international research project led by the University of Edinburgh Law School, which delivers research and tracks data on conflict and its resolution. Russia's doctrine holds that it would use nuclear weapons in response to conventional aggression, quote-unquote, critical to the national security of Russia. What that means is still debatable. Over the past few years, Russia has used nuclear threats during its occupation of Georgian and Ukrainian territories. Moreover, over the past year, Putin's nuclear threats have become much more intense. As such, in 2022, the specter of nuclear weapons returned as a top security issue around the globe. Arguably, Putin's nuclear threats were employed in an attempt to broadly achieve two goals. One of the goals was to compel Ukraine to yield to Russian demands, and the second was to deter NATO from intervening in the Russia-Ukraine war. How well Putin's strategy worked is a matter of debate. Nonetheless, one of the things that is clear at present is that Putin's actions will have major consequences for arms control for decades to come. To discuss these issues, I'd like to welcome three very distinguished guests. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Stephen Pifer, non-resident senior fellow in the Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Initiative at the Stroll Talbot Center for Security, Strategy and Technology, and the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. He's also a veteran diplomat and served as U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, as well as Ambassador to Ukraine. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Sarah Bidgood, Director of the Eurasia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Monterey, California. Her research focuses on US-Soviet and US-Russia non-proliferation cooperation and arms control. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Dr. Oliver Meier, Senior Researcher at the Berlin Office of the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg, where he coordinates the Challenges to Deep Cuts project and CBWNet. Welcome to all three of you. Firstly, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Pifer. If you could unmute for me, please. Nuclear weapons are normally used to deter and compel. What does the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war tell us about the debate regarding nuclear deterrence and nuclear compellence? And in particular, could you please comment about how Putin's nuclear threats failed to consolidate Russian claims over Ukrainian territories like Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia? More importantly, given its strategic value to Russia and in the context of nuclear deterrence, what do you see for Crimea? Thank you. Over to you, Steve.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Leon. Now, I've long felt that the main, if not the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter a nuclear attack on oneself and one's allies. And I think when you try to expand the deterrence or compellence effect of nuclear weapons beyond those limited goals, it becomes more difficult. And it seems to me that what Russia has done in its conflict against Ukraine illustrates that fact. I think we saw the Kremlin try to play the nuclear threat in particular in September. That was when Russia supposedly annexed 4 oblasts, 4 regions of Ukraine: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And the Kremlin tried to portray that as then Russian territory. Therefore, that territory would be defended with all available means. And that led a number of analysts, including me, to think that at least the Kremlin was trying to introduce the threat of nuclear weapons should Ukraine continue to press the counteroffensive against those territories. And as you said, Leon, there were 2 targets to this threat. One was to Kyiv, to just basically to persuade Kyiv to capitulate and to dissuade Kyiv from attacking those oblasts, which were now of a new quality in the Russian eyes. They were now part of Russia. And the second goal was to dissuade the West from continuing to provide Ukraine with weapons. And it failed in both cases. First of all, the Ukrainians see this war as existential. They understand that if they lose, their democracy's gone, and the vision that I think motivates a lot of particularly young Ukrainians in becoming a normal European state is gone. Ukrainians also understand what losing to Russia and Russian occupation means. They saw it in Bucha, Irpin, Izium, and Mariupol. It means filtration camps, mass graves, torture chambers, and the kidnapping of Ukrainian children for adoption by Russian families. And so from the Ukrainian aspect, the introduction of the threat of a Russian nuclear strike really didn't make this war any worse. And I don't think that if you look over the 4 months since the Russian played that threat in September, you've seen any real impact on Ukrainian military operations. Likewise, it didn't have an impact on the Western flow of arms. In fact, you've seen even last week now, agreement by at least 3 Western countries now to provide armor, or at least armored personnel carriers, and in the French case, light tanks to Ukraine. And what the West responded was that were the Russians to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, there would be serious consequences. Properly, they did not specify publicly what that would mean. But I think there was recognition in the West that caving to that Russian threat would not only have consequences in Ukraine, but there would be a learning process in the Kremlin, and the West would face similar nuclear threats in the future. I also believe that by early October, the Kremlin began to realize that the threat was failing both with Kyiv and the West. And there was also, I think, a sense in the Kremlin that the threat was counterproductive with countries such as India and China. And so I think that from really the end of October, you've seen Moscow purposely move to lower the nuclear rhetoric. It began on late end of October when President Putin spoke to the Valdai Discussion Club, and this question of the nuclear threats came up, and Putin said, "We've never made a nuclear threat with regards to this war. This is all allegations by the West that are designed to tarnish Russia's good image." A week later, the Russian Foreign Ministry put out a statement on prevention of nuclear war, which said the right things. I think about a week or two after that, there was a meeting between the Russian and the Chinese foreign ministers. The Chinese foreign minister came out and said, Foreign Minister Lavrov has said that a threat of nuclear war is unacceptable and inadmissible. And then Lavrov signed off to good language on the inadmissibility of nuclear threats at the G20 summit in Bali. So it seems to me that Moscow's moved away from that threat. Now, you raised the question about Crimea, and the question would be, would the Russians revive that threat with regards to Crimea? I believe Crimea matters more to Moscow than the other Ukrainian territories that Russian forces have occupied. It was the only, prior to 2014, Crimea was the only part of Russia where ethnic Russians constituted a majority of the population. And that's probably changed over the last 9 years because a number of ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars have left, and there's been an influx of ethnic Russians. Sevastopol Harbor is the best harbor on the Black Sea, and the Russians need that because they do not have facilities in Russian ports in the Black Sea to house all the Black Sea fleet, and there's this historical connection. So I think the Russians, might try to make or play that nuclear card, but I don't think it would have any more success. In fact, the Ukrainians are already chipping away at that. You've seen attacks mounted by the Ukrainians against Crimea, the attack on the Kerch Bridge, followed up by the attack using small unmanned boats to attack Russian ships in Sevastopol Harbor. You've seen air drone attacks. And my guess is that if the Russians tried to use the nuclear threat to dissuade the Ukrainians from military operations against Crimea, they would fail in the same way. The Ukrainians would keep fighting. The West would not accept that threat as legitimate. And the threat would be counterproductive with India, China, and the global South. So my guess is that the Russians, should they try to revive that threat, are going to find that it does not succeed in the way that they might hope.
Thank you, Steve, and also for bringing in the quote unquote China and India component into this discussion, because they of course have enabled Russia to get away with certain things, by virtue of purchasing oil from Russia and with that special relationship with China. But they've also, as you said, played an incredibly important role in trying to tame the Kremlin not to use the nuclear card, which is important. Let's move now to Sarah. Sarah also joining us from California, and it's very early there, but thank you so much for joining us. I have a very short but important question for you. How might the Russia-Ukraine war impact on Russia's nuclear posture? Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Leon, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this important panel with such distinguished co-panelists. It's great to be here. Steve definitely talked about some of the ways in which the war might influence sort of Russia's thinking about the use of nuclear weapons. And Leon, in your introduction, you laid out a couple of points as well about Russian declaratory policy. I think it's important to kind of have a sense for what the status quo ante was, I suppose, before the war. So I'll just review a couple of the scenarios that you outlined that Russia lays out in its military doctrine and its deterrence strategy, where it talks about the ways in which it envisions potentially using nuclear weapons. So in Russia's 2014 military strategy, they talk about using nuclear weapons potentially in response to the use of nuclear weapons or other types of weapons of mass destruction against Russia or its allies. And then they also talk about the use of nuclear weapons in response to aggression against the Russian Federation with conventional weapons where the very existence of the state is in jeopardy. So these kinds of big existential crises. We got a little bit more clarity about some of the additional scenarios in which nuclear weapons could potentially be used by Russia in 2020 when they released this Foundations of State Policy of the Russian Federation in the area of nuclear deterrence. So those kind of principles of deterrence document. And it adds to what we learned already from the military doctrine by telling us that, Moscow could consider using nuclear weapons in response to reliable data about the launch of ballistic missiles attacking the territory of Russia or its allies. And that document also tells us that nuclear weapons could be used in response to an attack by an adversary against critical government or military sites of the Russian Federation that would undermine nuclear force response action. So basically kind of command and control type structures. Now, it's important to remember, and I think we should articulate this, that declaratory policy is declaratory policy. The same people who wrote those documents would be responsible for their implementation. They're not kind of an edict that comes down from on high about how to use nuclear weapons. They are written by people who would ultimately be responsible for their implementation. And that can, look very different in a military situation than it might as you're kind of writing it in the abstract or thinking about how you might use these weapons in a non-war setting. So with that in mind, I think it can also be really useful to, look at Russian force composition and its nuclear strategy as kind of described by Russian military thinkers and planners. And I continue to think that the best work that has been done in that area is Kristen Van Brusgaard's work, where she looks at Russian nuclear strategy and conventional inferiority. So she had this terrific piece that came out in 2020, where she finds that, even though Russia's conventional precision strike weapons and air and missile defense capabilities have improved, significantly since the post-Soviet period, she finds, and I'm going to quote her here, that Russia continues to rely on nuclear weapons to deter and manage escalation in regional conflicts that threaten its existence. So again, we're kind of talking about this idea of an existential threat. And more specifically, she argues, and I'm going to quote her again here, that nuclear threats or use are relevant escalation management tools in scenarios where Russia thinks that it has exhausted all of its available conventional escalation tools and is unwilling to back down even at the risk of a nuclear conflict. So that adds and kind of complicates, I think, the landscape that we get from just looking at the declaratory policy. And then, as you've already pointed out, and as Steve talked about in his remarks, we have this kind of third set of data, which are, statements from Putin or other relevant Russian officials that seem to suggest either implicitly or in some cases slightly more explicitly, that Russia might use nuclear weapons somehow in the context of the war in Ukraine. And those statements I found to be really interesting as I've looked at them, because they don't always align very clearly with either Russian declaratory policy, at least in the ways that I would interpret it. They have to do some, kind of linguistic gymnastics to describe, how maybe sanctions and things like that could represent an existential threat to Russia, things like that. Nor do they seem to come at a point where Russia has exhausted its conventional escalation tools, which is that kind of narrative that Kristen talks about in her work. In fact, we saw these nuclear threats levied very early on in the conflict, long before I would say conventional escalation tools had been exhausted. So if that's sort of the status quo as we see it now, to get back to your question, Leon, and I'll wrap up in a second here, how might the war impact upon Russia's nuclear posture as we understand it? I'm going to give a speculative answer because, unfortunately, of course, we don't know, when the war is going to end, and I think things could really change over the course of that conflict in some important ways. But I personally don't think, with respect to Russian declaratory policy, that we're going to see a big dramatic change from what I've outlined here. I think having a fairly high threshold for nuclear use has actually proven quite useful to Russia over the course of the war, because as Steve pointed out, it gives Russian officials some latitude to say to the West, oh, when you're sort of accusing us of potentially thinking about using nuclear weapons, you're really fear-mongering, because our declaratory policy outlines these specific scenarios where nuclear weapons could be used, and clearly we're not in any of those. So it's actually kind of proven to be a useful, I think, political tool for Russia over the course of this conflict. But if we zoom out a little bit beyond nuclear posture, I think it's quite a bit harder to say what's going to happen either with Russian nuclear strategy or these implicit threats that we have seen Putin and other officials using for coercion, or what some people call kind of blackmail purposes in the context of this war. I would say, I think for the moment, from Moscow's perspective, these implicit nuclear threats and this kind of ambiguous signaling have had their intended effect for the most part. The West has not intervened directly in a military fashion in the war on Kyiv's behalf, which seems to be what Russia wants. But that's not necessarily going to be an unending, source of leverage or coercion for the reasons that Steve pointed out. It kind of loses its credibility at some point. And also you have actors who are important allies to Russia who are saying, putting pressure on Russia not to use nuclear weapons. And so I'd be very curious to hear also what Oliver thinks about that, because I think there's a lot to be discussed here. And then just a final point when we talk about strategy, and this is somewhat related, I do think that as the war goes on, it may leave Russia temporarily more reliant on non-strategic nuclear weapons than it was kind of at the outset, in part because Russia's conventional capabilities are being at least temporarily depleted as a result of the war. But on the other hand, I mean, it's also the case that if you're going to kind of use nuclear threats to get what you want, they do have to seem a little bit credible. And so there's also this incentive to kind of rely a little bit more heavily on non-strategic nuclear weapons as part of your deterrence posture. That obviously has real consequences that can raise the risk of miscalculation or miscommunication. And it's also going to make arms control more difficult. And that's something I know we're going to talk about a little bit later. But that's kind of my take from where we are now. A lot of unknowns, and I think a lot will depend on where the war goes. But that's what I would say in answer to your question.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that was a great complementary response to what Steve also gave earlier. And it will be interesting later in the discussion, perhaps, to hear also how you think, given what we know now, when we're talking about the knowns, not just the unknowns, how that might impact supplying the type of weapons that Ukraine's been asking for over the past 3-4 months in particular, especially, and also maybe circling back to that issue of a possible no-fly zone in Ukraine, whether that would also impact on that discussion. But let's talk about that later. Oliver, I'd like to turn to you now, and Oliver joins us from Berlin. How does the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war affect NATO's nuclear posture, especially with the future accession of Finland and Sweden to the alliance? And also, were there any significant changes in NATO's strategic concept? Thank you, Oliver.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you also for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel together with two deep cuts commissioners. That's really nice. To answer your question, I mean, the simple answer is I think that clearly NATO is relying more on deterrence, both conventional and nuclear, and is increasing investments in defense and deterrence capabilities, no doubt about that. We see that across the board, including in Germany, and a shift, I think, in some NATO member states, and we see it also reflected in the new strategic concept, which you asked about. Deterrence and defense posture has at least two aspects, the software and the hardware, if you like. And if you look at the strategic concept and the way it describes deterrence, it's not only clear that deterrence has become more important, but that NATO has also broadened the concept to some degree. It states in the new strategic concept that the deterrence and defense posture is based on an appropriate mix of nuclear, conventional, and that's new, missile defense capabilities complemented by space and cyber. So if you compare that to the 2010, to the last strategic concept, clearly a broadening of the concept. It also states that allies will employ such tools in a proportionate, coherent, and integrated way to respond to all threats to their security in a manner and timing of their own choosing and in a domain of their own choosing. So I think this idea that also is reflected in some Russian thinking about deterrence across domains, and we now also find in NATO thinking. This thinking in terms of integrated deterrence clearly also applies to the nuclear part, the nuclear leg of the deterrence and defense posture. And in the strategic concept, NATO says that it's committed to ensuring greater integration and coherence of capabilities and activities across all domains and spectrums of conflict, while, of course, reaffirming the unique and distinct role of nuclear deterrence. But clearly, there's a degree of integrating the nuclear dimension of deterrence into other dimension. And that's, I think, a reflection also of Russian actions, not only since February this year, but going back way before that. On the hardware side, actually, these changes are not really reflected yet to such a great degree, or maybe not yet. Most of the changes in NATO's nuclear posture that we see going underway have a longer history, in some cases dating back to pre-2014, the deployment of modernized nuclear weapons in Europe. The B6112 has been in the books and in the planning for a long time. The changes to F-35, the more modern delivery systems for the US nuclear weapons deployed in Europe has been underway for some time, and even in Germany, which was not clearly committed on which type of system Germany would buy. Clearly, the war has had an impact, but maybe not such a decisive impact. I personally think that would have happened even without the Russian attack. So, long-term changes underway in terms of hardware. There are some countervailing trends and some limits to this. We've heard clear statements from NATO Secretary General that NATO has no plans and sees no need to deploy new nuclear systems at the time, particularly not intermediate range nuclear systems. A very important limit to the changes that also has not been challenged in the context of the Madrid summit in the summer, where the new strategic concept was approved. You asked about the impact of the accession of Finland and Sweden to the alliance. Again, both countries are committed to not deploying nuclear weapons on their territory, I think, and have made at least political statements in that regard. But there may be indirect effects of the war. Of course, Russia now has an additional very long border with NATO, and if Sarah is right, and I believe she is, that Russia will have to rely, almost doesn't have to, but is likely to rely on nuclear deterrence more also in this region. NATO will have to react to that in some way, shape, or form if both countries are NATO members, or even if they're not NATO members, actually. Again, this will likely increase defense spending and some way, shape of balancing Russia's capabilities here. We've also seen since the war the US nuclear posture review and a confirmation that the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, which would be one of these systems that potentially could be used for what's called escalation control, the administration remains committed to not building that system. Be interested to hear what Steve thinks, whether that decision is going to stand. But so I think there's limits to what NATO will do to counter Russian nuclear threats, as Sarah has and Steve have outlined them. Personally, I think there's little reason actually to increase reliance on nuclear deterrence. As we've heard, at a strategic level, deterrence seems to be working as it is. Both sides have been deterred from attacking each other, directly intervening, in the case of NATO, into the war. The fear of nuclear blackmail, at least to a certain degree, that was and remains at the core of the justification for the forward basing of nuclear weapons in Europe, seems to not have worked, at least in the sense that Western states were intimidated to the degree that they would not supply modern and heavy weapons to the Ukraine. They continue to supply more and more sophisticated weapons. So if that was Putin's intention with the nuclear threats, clearly this is not working. So that also, I think, weakens the case for additional reliance on these types of weapons that are forward deployed. And as Sarah said, Russia is conventionally weaker than we thought before the war, and in all likelihood will come out of this war even weaker than it is right now. But maybe most remarkably, and that's my last remark, I think, are the statements we've seen from senior Biden administration officials that even in the case that Russia would use a nuclear weapon, the response would not necessarily have to be a nuclear one, that there are many capabilities, particularly the United States has, that could have a devastating effect on Russia's military capabilities without resorting to nuclear weapons. So I think this really greatly weakens the case for additional reliance on nuclear weapons, at least in terms of NATO capabilities. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Oliver. Now, you talked about NATO in particular, but let's talk about non-NATO nuclear states also. Shortly before Putin's February escalation in 2022, the Stockholm-based Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, stated that there were quote-unquote clear indications that the reduction of global nuclear arsenals since the end of Cold War has come to an end. Furthermore, SIPRI warned all of the nuclear armed states are increasing or upgrading their arsenals. This is a worrying trend. Now, some analysts point out that Russia's aggression in Ukraine may increase the demand for nuclear weapons, especially for non-nuclear states or states that are not under the NATO umbrella. What is your assessment of the future of arms control, Oliver? You're muted.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, in terms of the trends that you cited and that clearly are visible, unfortunately, some of these trends were visible even before the Russian attack on Ukraine. Nuclear reductions had basically come to a halt in many countries. They had been reversed. Russia had embarked on an overall modernization of its strategic nuclear arsenal even before the February attack. And in some cases, we must assume even before the 2014 annexation of Crimea, going back to maybe 2008, which seemed to have been, around that time, a point in time when Russia decided to rely more on nuclear deterrence. In terms of the other question you asked, what lessons can we draw about the value of nuclear weapons? I think I would agree with, I think, what Sarah also said and Steve also, that we have to be cautious to not prematurely come to any conclusion about what lessons can be drawn if there is nuclear weapons use, which is not impossible. And even though Russia may have lowered the temperature, fortunately. Still, there is in the Russian military thinking, as Sarah said, a thought and a tradition of increasing the costs on what they consider the enemy. And if conventional means are exhausted, there is still a possibility that Russia could choose to increase costs by using nuclear weapons. So we have to remain aware of this danger also, because clearly our assumptions about rationality and the rational use of nuclear weapons are challenged by the way Russia has behaved and the way Putin is also talking about nuclear weapons. I mean, some of this is really scary if you listen to his speeches. We've seen other presidents which also talked in scary ways about nuclear weapons. So, we have this problem that we tend to assume that there's a rationality behind nuclear deterrence that may be not based on facts. In terms of the the implications for arms control, clearly some areas of arms control will be incredibly difficult, particularly conventional arms control, with all the investments going on across the board. In the Deep Cuts Commission, we have made an argument and that it still, under these conditions, is a sound policy to continue to try to separate some areas of military competition, particularly when it comes to strategic nuclear weapons, from the ongoing conflict, if that is feasible. But specifically, we have argued that both sides should sit down and try to find agreement on an agreement, on a treaty or agreement to replace the New START Treaty on Strategic Nuclear Arms, which will expire in February 2026 if both sides do not sit down at the table. Now, Russia, since the end of last year, seems to reject that thinking that you can have areas of cooperation that should be to some degree viewed separately from the overall conflict. There have been senior Russian officials which said that there can be no business as usual. We've heard Minister Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov, talk about or make the argument that it's impossible to discuss strategic stability against the background of the ongoing war in Ukraine. That's a very dangerous line of thinking. I want to recall that even during the Cold War, when tempers were going high and risks were great, both sides were able to talk about risk reduction, particularly to reduce the risk that conflict can escalate to the nuclear level. So we need to get back to that table and continue to argue that this is in the strategic interest also of Russia and the whole world, to be frank, that we avoid an unrestricted arms race also in the nuclear area. Some elements of that, unfortunately, we already see, but we should at least try to preserve what we have and talk about how to expand that. I'm sure Steve and Sarah can go into more detail on how that can be done, but let me leave it at that maybe.
Thank you, Oliver. No, I think that's a good kind of pivot to the next part of our discussion. You mentioned Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty START and New START. So I'm going to turn to Steve now, and for the benefit of our audience, through bilateral negotiations, the US and Russia have significantly reduced their nuclear arsenals. And Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think for the US alone, that meant a 88% reduction of nuclear warheads since 1967 for the United States. START and New START in particular was central to these efforts. However, at the end of last year, as Oliver mentioned, talks about implementation of New START were postponed. Now, for the benefit of our audience, what is New START? What's the significance thereof? And how has the pandemic and the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war impacted on its implementation? Thank you, Steve.
Sure. Well, the New START Treaty was signed in 2010. It entered into force in 2011. Originally, it had a 10 years duration, so it was due to expire by its terms in February of 2021. The Trump administration didn't really show a lot of serious interest in its extension, but the Biden administration, that was one of their first items of business. In fact, on the first full day in office, President Biden said he would move to extend New START. The United States and Russia agreed to do that. So New START is now in effect until February of 2026. It cannot be extended again. The treaty basically required that the United States and Russia by 2018 reduce their strategic forces to the lowest levels in decades. Each side was allowed 700 deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers. And a deployed missile would be a missile in a missile silo or on board a submarine, something that could be launched very quickly. The second limit was each side was allowed no more than 1,550 deployed strategic warheads. I'd put an asterisk there that 1,550 means more like about 1,750 to 1,800, because while that limit counts the exact number of warheads on deployed ballistic missiles, the sides agreed to attribute each heavy bomber with only one warhead, and the bombers can carry more. And then there was a third limit, which was 800 deployed and non-deployed launches for ballistic missiles and heavy bombers. A non-deployed intercontinental ballistic missile launcher would be a missile silo that contains no missile. Right? The U.S. Air Force maintains about 50 of those. And compared to the START I treaty, which was signed in 1991, entered into force in 1994, and expired in 2009, New START had significant reductions. Whereas the New START limit was 1,550 warheads, START I, it was 6,000. And whereas New START allows the sides each side 800 deployed and non-deployed missile silos and bombers, the number in START I was 1,600. So this is pretty significant reductions. In additional national technical means, New START also contains a number of verification measures, data exchanges. Every 6 months, Washington and Moscow exchange huge amounts of data on their strategic forces. There are notifications between Washington and Moscow at the rate of about 2,000 per year on specific changes to strategic forces, and that gives each side sort of real-time updates as to how the other side's strategic forces are changing. And then the treaty allows up to 18 on-site inspections a year. Now, this has been an issue. Back in 2020, with concerns about COVID, American and Russian officials agreed to suspend the on-site inspections. Last summer, the United States said, well, COVID is sort of receding now as a concern, and proposed resuming those on-site inspections. The Russians were not prepared to do so. The Russians said that this would give America unilateral advantages. It was not clear what they meant. But in early November of last year, there was agreement that the Bilateral Consultative Commission, that's the implementing body for the New START Treaty, would meet at the end of November. And that would be the logical place to discuss things such as resumption of on-site inspections and other issues related to the implementation of the treaty. Unfortunately, the Russians canceled that at the last minute. In fact, I understand that the American side had tickets in hand, bags packed, and the day before they left, we're told that the Russians had pulled the plug. It seems to be very much a political decision by the Kremlin, and it's of concern. I think the longer that we go without the on-site inspections allowed by the treaty, the greater the questions about the ability of the sides to verify the limits in the treaty, and also the absence of a meeting of the BCC, it's the Bilateral Consultative Commission, it's supposed to meet twice a year, is also going to raise questions. I fear is also going to be used by opponents of arms control in Washington to say, see, this is another reason why arms control with Russia doesn't work. And I would argue still that the New START Treaty remains very much in the interest of both the United States and Russia. So I think there's a risk here that could endanger both sides' security, and I hope they can find a way to get the Bilateral Consultative Commission back on track to meet and then restore these inspections.
Thank you, Stephen, and also for pointing out that this exchange of communication between Washington and Moscow is not just a matter of a red telephone from one desk to another, as portrayed in the Hollywood movies, but that there are serious implications for these treaties, given the amount of data being exchanged between the US and Russia. So on that note, let's ask Sarah to kind of tag on to what you said. Sarah, New START will expire in 2026, as pointed out earlier. Now, from a US perspective and under current conditions, what scenarios do you foresee, not just for negotiating, but also implementing a follow-on treaty? And I specifically added that part of implementation, because we all know that an agreement and implementation are two very different issues. So please tell us your thoughts. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Leon. Yes, I'll kind of pick up on some of what both Steve and Oliver said, I think. I mean, I have to say that I, at this point, am pretty pessimistic about opportunities in the near future for negotiating a follow-on to New START. And that's a change for me, because over the summer, I saw, during the context of the NPT review conference, there was this language in the draft final document that said that the United States and Russia commit to pursuing negotiations in good faith on a successor framework to New START prior to its expiration. So I thought, okay, maybe this is a little bit promising. Maybe there's something here. I had a similar reaction when, as Steve was talking about, it seemed like there was going to be this meeting of the Treaties Bilateral Consultative Commission in Egypt in November of last year. But, of course, the NPT final document wasn't adopted. Steve was just describing, this BCC meeting was postponed. So I'm unfortunately back to feeling fairly negative about prospects for a follow-on to that treaty, at least in the near term. And I'm a perennial optimist, so I do think that there are prospects for later on. I should say here that I don't think that the problem is that, the United States would be unwilling or unable to come to the negotiating table on this issue, while the war is happening, which had been a question for me, I have to say, when the war sort of began. My impression from everything that I think the Biden administration has been saying, especially recently, is that, they seem to see arms control with Russia as something that is very much in the US national interest, rather than something that's kind of an altruistic act or a gift to Russia. So that's really not the source of my pessimism at all. Instead, and maybe contrary to some of the conventional wisdom that we often have in our field, my pessimism comes from the fact that we know from the historical record that nuclear crises can really make arms control difficult, at least in their kind of immediate aftermath. And I would argue that we are in a nuclear crisis right now for many of the reasons that we've been talking about here. They create deep mistrust, they create deep suspicion between parties, and we're definitely seeing that play out in the US and Russian relationship right now. And that kind of an environment, I think, can really make it a lot more difficult for all of the parties at a negotiating table to exhibit the kinds of flexibility that are necessary to reach an agreement. And particularly in the context of arms control, I think it can kind of allow people to get this tunnel vision where they're really focused on, what's sometimes called ironclad verification, this idea that you can have a treaty that is so ironclad that nobody can possibly cheat or violate or do anything undetected. And traditionally that has stood in the way of kind of concluding treaties. And I'd be curious to hear, I'm sure Steve has some insights he could share, in that regard as well, having been a negotiator. But I think the other part of this is that, as Steve alluded to in his comments, nuclear crises can really generate a lot of interest in capabilities that could be used for kind of, escalation management, things like that. Oliver talked about that as well in his comments. So for example, here I'm thinking about, tactical or low yield nuclear weapons. And environments like that, you often have, domestic political tides turning against, giving up a capability or accepting limits on a capability or something like that. And that's already going to make the environment tough for arms control. What's more, I think that, we've heard the US say repeatedly, including since, the conclusion of the New START treaty itself, that the next agreement needs to cover Russia's tactical nuclear weapons. And for the reasons I outlined in my earlier comments, I think that's going to be really, really difficult right now, in part because there could be this increased interest or reliance upon non-strategic nuclear weapons for Russia in the near term. And of course, the longer talks remain on ice, the longer talks don't happen, I would say the harder it is to kind of get back into the swing of things, both because you kind of lose that political momentum, that domestic political momentum, but also because I would imagine, those relationships deteriorate between negotiators. You lose some of that trust, that rapport. And without regular engagement, you don't have that. And that's true whether you're negotiating a treaty or whether you're talking about the implementation side of a treaty as well. But I started out my comments by saying, I'm a perennial optimist. I do think if you look at the historical record, there are typically these kind of real doldrums that follow a nuclear crisis, but oftentimes with strong political leadership on either side, it does prove possible to get back to the negotiating table. It doesn't happen immediately, but I still feel very hopeful that things are going to get back on track. This is something that is ultimately in the interest, I continue to believe, of both Russia and the United States. I think it's, negotiating strategic arms control treaties is really important. And it's important for many reasons, not just because of the treaties themselves, but because the implementation affords a degree of predictability, stability, transparency in that relationship. And we really need that right now. So I do believe that, eventually we'll find our way back to the negotiating table, but unfortunately, I think it's going to be a while before that happens.
Thank you, Sarah. I think it's really important what you're saying, this issue of trust. I personally am skeptical that you always need trust for an agreement, as Reagan used to like to quote the Russians, trust but verify. I mean, it was a nice way of saying verification is much more important than trust, but we do need those channels to stay open to negotiate anything at this point. Let's turn again to Oliver. Oliver, should Russia use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine? The effect, of course, would be devastating, far beyond the war zone. Most of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons have yields the equivalent of at least 100 kilotons of dynamite. And for context, the 2 nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the Second World War had an explosive yield that equaled 15 and 20 kilotons of dynamite, respectively. Now, that said, as Steve mentioned earlier, China also has an interest to avoid any form of nuclear escalation. And we also know that US policymakers have been keen to bring China into some form of trilateral strategic arms negotiation. How does the Russia-Ukraine war impact on that configuration? Thank you, Oliver.
That's a very good and difficult question to answer at a very basic level. And I'm glad you cited, the effects of even small nuclear weapons. The most important task for arms control is, again, to reduce the risk that these weapons are used again. For arms control, that's going back to the roots, if you like. That's where arms control started in the 1950s. The first conference was on preventing a surprise attack, as it was called, unsuccessful, unfortunately, but that's where arms control started out from. So for arms controllers, this is not unfamiliar territory, but the level of ambition, because of the reasons also that Sarah and Steve described, probably has to be lowered. And at the same time, as you said, we have one of the permanent members of the Security Council, one of the 5 nuclear weapon states that are recognized by the NPT, trying to increasing its nuclear capability at a speed that none of the other weapon states is currently matching, and clearly the main focus of that nuclear arms buildup is the United States. China is trying to balance the US, and that's one of the reasons why not only the United States, but also other NATO members have called on China to at least be more transparent, but also to come to the table on nuclear arms talks and limitations. When you look at Chinese policies, there are, if you take a broader look, a little bit ambivalent, I would say. Clearly, we've seen a new level of solidarity with Russia before the war, and to some degree also after Russia attacked Ukraine, but also some visible fault lines with Russia. Clearly, China is concerned about a possible nuclear escalation of the war. It did sign on to this G20 statement that Steve cited, I think, in the beginning, which called nuclear threats inadmissible. It made similar statements when the German chancellor, ahead of the G20 summit, visited Beijing. Statements that I think clearly were directed at Russia. They were the first statements without Russia at the table when Olaf Scholz went to Beijing. And also remarkably, China did not back Russia on Ukraine at the NPT review conference. It did so on other issues, but it did not defend Russia on this issue in New York at the NPT review conference. And we heard that on this issue, there was no strategic cooperation, and apparently China was also quite unhappy when Russia torpedoed the agreement on the final document that had been negotiated among treaty members. So that's, I think, the tension that China on arms control, generally speaking, is faced with. On the one hand, a strategic alliance with Russia and the attempt to balance the United States. On the other hand, clearly, I think, an interest not to let these multilateral arrangements that we have on nuclear arms control and other arms control issues collapse, because they would also endanger some of China's economic and political interests. That's something where I think Western policy can come in, try to engage China on some of these issues. For example, on proliferation, non-proliferation issues, maybe also on some humanitarian arms control issues, where China at least has joined some of these discussions that would require of NATO to look beyond deterrence, if you like, and also develop a concept of how to try to at least engage China on some of these issues. But the effect of the war against Ukraine is difficult to gauge, I think, at this time, also because we don't know how this war will end. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. I think there's also some interesting points. I'm gonna stick to the theme of New START also and go back to Steve again. Steve, given that strategic arms control negotiations could take place while the Russia-Ukraine war is raging, and also in the context of the failure of the Budapest memorandum to prevent Russian aggression against Ukraine, one can arguably expect Russia to use negotiations to try to throw Ukraine under the bus. How do you think Ukraine will feature in future negotiations, and what are the traps that US negotiators will have to be wary of? Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, no, I think you correctly pointed out, I mean, back at the end of the beginning of the 1990s, in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, Ukraine had on its territory the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, and it gave that up in large part because in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, Russia committed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence, and committed not to use force or threaten to use force against Ukraine. But I really think, actually, I'm going to flip your question around. At this point in time, it seems to me that Russia is not using arms control against Ukraine, that's already done in the past, but it's now using Ukraine against arms control. So as Sarah alluded to, I think there was agreement, and I think correctly so, that despite US-Russia relations being at their lowest point in decades, the side still had an interest in controlling the nuclear competition. And there was still a reason for arms control. And you saw that, I mean, even as late as June, President Biden said in a message to the Arms Control Association that, we were going to get back to strategic stability talks. 2 or 3 days later, Dmitry Peskov, that's Putin's press spokesperson, he expressed a similar desire. So there was a sense that the sides, might somehow isolate the arms control portion and keep that going despite all of the difficulties in the relationship that have been accelerated by the Russia-Ukraine war. And unfortunately, now we've seen the Russians have blocked the meeting of the Bilateral Consultative Commission, and that seems also to have held up the strategic stability dialogue. The United States did have a precondition for getting back to those broader talks, which was having the New START treaty again fully functioning. But you now have the Russians saying, well, this kind of dialogue cannot be independent of the broader relationship, and that's been affected by American policy on the Russia-Ukraine war. That's unfortunate. I think that's incorrect. I think the Russians are making a mistake, but it is what it is. And where I think it plays out in arms control is if and when the sides get back to strategic stability talks and this discussion of what comes after New START, as Sarah alluded to, it's going to make achieving Biden administration goals for that follow-on treaty much more difficult. If you look at the New START treaty, it covers probably about 1/3 of the warheads in the total US and Russian nuclear arsenals. It covers deployed strategic warheads, but a warhead that comes off of an intercontinental ballistic missiles goes into storage for purposes of arms control just disappeared. New START does not cover reserve strategic warheads. It does not cover any non-strategic nuclear weapons. And the Biden administration had said very early on in 2021, it wanted the next negotiation to cover all nuclear weapons, including non-strategic nuclear weapons. Now, Moscow, going back to 2011, right after the New START treaty was entered into force, never showed a lot of enthusiasm for negotiating non-strategic nuclear weapons. And I think, as Sarah mentioned, part of that was they saw non-strategic nuclear weapons as a backup for conventional inferiority vis-a-vis NATO and China. The Russians, since 2007, have invested a huge amount of money in their conventional forces. In modern, I think they say that perhaps 85 to 90% of their conventional forces were modernized over the past 15 years. And what we've seen is a really dramatic underperformance in the war against Ukraine, where the Russians had been fought to a standstill, lost a huge amount of equipment. So I think that's going to make the Russians in a future negotiation even more reluctant to see non-strategic nuclear weapons on the negotiating table. Another issue is since about a dozen years now, the Russians have attached priority to limiting what they refer to as long-range, precision-guided conventional strike weapons. And that's been an area where for many years, the United States with conventionally armed, long-ranged, air-launched and sea-launched cruise missiles had an advantage. Well, there was some thought that the Russians were beginning to catch up. They just deployed their own long-range cruise missile capabilities against Syria back in 2017, 2018. And the idea was, as the Russians caught up, perhaps this might become less of an issue. But again, what we've seen is the failure of these systems to perform. I think the Pentagon estimates that in some cases, these missiles miss their targets 60% of the time. That seems to be a much worse performance record than their American counterparts. Moreover, the Russians have expended a large number of these conventional missiles in their war against Ukraine. So the gap in numbers between the United States and Russia now is huge. And my guess is, again, when you get back to a broader strategic dialogue, the Russians are going to be making more of an issue of that because they see that they still lag behind the United States. And finally, there's a third issue here, which is just the time factor, is that you weren't going to get to a follow-on negotiation until you could use that strategic stability dialogue to define the mandate for a negotiation. Well, we've lost now a year. Conventional wisdom in the United States is that if you get a treaty or agreement that has to go to the Senate for consent to ratification, you don't want that to happen in an election year. So we have, a year now to conduct a negotiation. I think it's going to be really, really hard to see much accomplished in arms control. Fortunately, because of the Biden administration's agreement to extend New START until February of 2026, there will be some time, but it's not that much time. And so I think the prospects for what I would see as a logical successor to New START, which would be a US-Russia agreement covering all their nuclear weapons, have been made much more difficult by what's happened in the war between Russia and Ukraine. And as the Russians now are going to be reassessing the need both for non-strategic nuclear weapons and also the difference in American and Russian long-range precision-guided conventional strike capabilities.
Yeah,
I try to be
given
an optimist like Sarah, but I find myself being pretty pessimistic about what this means in the short term for arms control prospects.
not a problem. And Oliver, you can drop off if need be. I do know you have a function. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Apologies for leaving a little bit early. Thanks. Bye-bye.
No problem. Thank you, Oliver. Steve and Sarah, if you still have a few minutes, I just have one or two more questions for you. And Steve, thank you for that reminder. You know, we always have to take into consideration this quote unquote two-level game, you know, where we're not just negotiating with the other side, you know, in this case between the US and Russia, but also you know, you negotiate with your domestically, also within your own team. That's where the Congress also comes in. But perhaps we need to ask for tips on that from Rose Gottemüller, you know, who succeeded in very rapidly negotiating a new start, of course, you know, during this last round. She was quite successful. So Sarah, and feel free to tag on to anything that Steve mentioned, especially if there are any areas of disagreement. I want to ask you, Russia recently supplied Belarus with Iskander-M systems. It's of course a two-guided missile with a range of up to about 500 kilometers or 300 miles and can carry conventional or nuclear warheads. Putin and Belarus's Lukashenko also announced in June last year that the Belarusian Su-25 aircraft will be modified in Russia, which will give it the ability to carry nuclear weapons. Now, considering that a ban on nuclear weapons was removed through changes to the Belarusian constitution in February last year, how do these developments impact on European security?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of this, of course, depends on whether Russia actually, you know, forward deploys these nuclear weapons to Belarus. So you know, the capabilities are one part of the equation, but the other half of the equation is, are there actually going to be nuclear weapons in Belarus? But if that were to happen, because, you know, as you just said, these systems are dual capable, so they can be either conventional or carry nuclear weapons. If that were to happen and nuclear weapons were to be on the territory of Belarus, my colleague Nikolai Sokov has written about this extensively, and I think his analysis is really excellent. He has written that this would afford Russia the capability to hold at risk a greater number of targets that would emerge in Poland and the Baltic states after NATO enhances its forward presence. So that would certainly have, you know, an impact on European security, not just, you know, for the reasons we might think, but also because it can increase the risk of inadvertent escalation of crises between Russia and NATO, particularly, you know, when you're talking about dual capable systems and in an environment where the relationship between those two parties is in such a dire predicament. One thing I would add, and I'll be conscious of time here because I know we're kind of butting up against the end of our session, but I think the other angle that's interesting to look at here, and that's also important, is the angle of multilateral nuclear diplomacy, which also affects not just European security, but international security more broadly. You know, what does this mean for the global nuclear order to have a non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT modify its constitution to remove those clauses, as you said, Leon, that confirm the aim to make the territory a nuclear-free zone and make the state neutral? I mean, there isn't really any, that's not a change that the NPT recognizes. It recognizes nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. It doesn't recognize, it doesn't even deal with this issue of sort of changes to the constitution that deal with eliminating elements that would allow a country to have nuclear weapons deployed on its territory. So that was, you know, something I really expected to see come up in the NPT, and I didn't hear it talked about as much as I thought it would. But as we move into the next review cycle, I mean, you know, these questions arise. How would these weapons be deployed? And what kind of arrangement would that look like? How would that jive or not jive with the no transfer provisions of the NPT? That's kind of an ironic thing to be talking about, given how frequently Russia raises the issue of the forward deployment of nuclear weapons in the NPT context. But, you know, that's sort of neither here nor there. And, you know, how would that development potentially undermine the NPT, or at least have a significant impact on its review process? I think those are kind of big questions that relate more to the international security space than just the European security landscape. but they really matter, I think, at a time where arguably the taboo, against the use of nuclear weapons is eroding. And we've just had 2 failed NPT review conferences in a row. So I think those are other dimensions that we also need to be thinking about too in that broader security landscape.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Sarah. No, those are great points. Also, I have one more question for you, Steve. Just to kind of pivot us back to this Russia-Ukraine war, under current sanctions, does Russia have the ability to ramp up its nuclear arsenal? And how much will the Kremlin turn to Iran and North Korea to supply Russia with hardware needed for its own systems? And how would that impact on arms control? Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, but let me, if I could just first add one point to Sarah's commentary about
Sure.
the Russian position in Belarus, is that for years now, the Russians have said that they would like to have in a new treaty a provision that nuclear weapons must be based on national territory. That, of course, is aimed at forcing the removal of this relatively small number of US nuclear weapons that are based, I think, in 5 NATO member territories, both for use by American Air Force, but also the use by host country air forces under programs of cooperation. So if the Russians actually do put nuclear weapons back into Belarus, they've completely undercut a major tenet of their nuclear demands going back for at least a decade. But on your question, first of all, it's difficult to say that. We do know that the Russians use Western-produced semiconductors and chips in their conventional weapons, their conventional strike weapons, because a number of these weapons have gone awry in Ukraine. We've seen Caliber missiles, we've seen a whole array of those missiles. They open them up, and lo and behold, they contain Western technology and their guidance and control systems. So we do know that the sanctions, to the extent that the sanctions hold, could have an impact on Russia's ability to produce long-range, precision-guided conventional strike weapons. We don't have similar insight into Russian nuclear weapons and Russian nuclear delivery systems. My guess is that the Russians probably need Western technology less in their nuclear weapons and delivery systems than their conventional weapons, for the reason that conventional weapons need accuracy. If a long-range conventionally armed cruise missile misses its target by 100 meters, it's not going to destroy the target, it will have failed. A nuclear weapon that misses its target by 100 meters because of the size of the explosion is still going to have a good chance of damaging most targets. So the accuracy is less of a factor. And there's a second thing here, which is that the Russians, with regards to their conventional weapons, have been expending them at a fairly high rate over the past 10 months. So at some point, presumably as they run out of their stock of Western components, they're going to have to come up with some alternative for the guidance systems in their Calibers and their KH-101 conventionally armed cruise missiles and such. They're not expending happily their nuclear weapon systems. So I think it's just a different situation. But let me say here that, this is, we just don't have insight into how much the Russians make use of Western components in their nuclear delivery system. So this is all kind of a guessing game, but I think it's a very major difference. You mentioned briefly North Korea and Iran. North Korea and Iran, that has zero impact on Russia's ability to maintain its nuclear forces. My understanding is they're getting drones from Iran for conventional purposes. They're getting ammunition from North Korea. So that's all about the fact that the Russians are expending conventional munitions and need other sources, and apparently are unable to produce at a sufficient rate replacements within Russia. So they're having to turn to North Korea and Iran. But that really won't have any impact, I think, on Russian strategic nuclear forces.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for that insight also. Sarah, I don't know if you saw, but I dropped you a personal note there. We have a ton of questions actually from our audience, and I did try to weave in some of those into the discussion earlier. But maybe to close us off, Sarah, you saw the questions from James Rice, one of our LSE alumni and from the University of Edinburgh, as well as from Boris Roshin. Can you just broadly answer those questions to close us off? Thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Leon. So the questions deal with, first we have one from James, who was asking about the role of the United Nations in negotiating a New START treaty. So, that would be a bilateral treaty. So it would be negotiated between representatives from the Russian Federation and representatives from the United States. But there are certainly ways in which, the sort of multilateral diplomacy architecture play a role in creating either, incentives for or actually articles, if we're talking about the NPT, for example, that mandate that parties to those treaties need to engage in good faith negotiations. So I would say that the United Nations plays an important role in kind of creating a multilateral basis for those negotiations to take place. But in the case of something like a follow-on to New START, that would be something that would be negotiated on a completely bilateral basis between Russia and the United States. And of course, it's hard to say what an ideal treaty would look like there, but I think I agree with Steve that, ideally it would cover all nuclear weapons, and we'll just have to see the extent to which that's actually possible for the many reasons that he and I have laid out in our comments. I think that will be pretty tough, but that would be the goal I would like to see for a follow-on treaty. And then, Boris, you asked, is it true that the main reason to reduce the number of nuclear warheads is purely replacement of old, non-powerful with more powerful warheads, which actually have increased nuclear potential? No, I would say that the reason to reduce the number of warheads is to reduce the number of warheads. And at least, in the way that I think about arms control, I think the objectives are multifold. They're to, reduce the overall number of nuclear warheads that exist on this earth in the interest of making the world moving towards this objective of a nuclear-free world, which is something to which the US and the Russian Federation have, committed as NPT member states. And I would say also, reducing the likelihood of unintended escalation in crises. That becomes, you have better odds of doing that when there are fewer weapons. And then I would say also, something that comes to mind for negotiators in both of those countries is going to be, how do we maintain our deterrent capability at the same time that we're engaging in these reductions? So it's kind of doing that calculus and thinking across a number of different planes that determines what the position of a state party would be going into a negotiation like this. And as you can tell, it's kind of, a game of three-dimensional chess, because there are a lot of considerations that have to go into play there. Thanks, Leon.
Thanks, Sarah. That was like very efficient use of time there. I'd like to thank all three of our panelists, Steve, Sarah, and Oliver, for your time and sharing your expertise for us. I certainly developed a great appreciation for arms control over the last few days as I prepared for this. It's almost as if you are speaking another language. And I think that's also important that we have to cultivate a new generation of arms controllers, and experts who are able to sit at the table and negotiate these very, very complex issues, especially when you bring in difficult issues like AI and cyber attacks and those into the mix of the traditional arms control discussions. So thank you so much for the work that all of you are doing on these very important issues, and also for reminding us how arms control directly relates also to this ongoing conflict, and that it could shape the debates going forward. Thank you also to our audience for tuning in. We have a number of Russia-Ukraine dialogues lined up for the next few months. Please register with us. I think there's more information on our webpage, and I'm really grateful that we kicked off the Russia-Ukraine dialogues early this year to continue to discuss and dissect this conflict. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you, Leon.